This is American Government for Wednesday, September 1st. As I mentioned in my recorded lecture for Monday, I didn't quite finish up with those notes. So in the class notes that I've sent out this evening on Tuesday, I have included the last part of Monday's lecture on the second great set of theoretical teachings on human nature. We had just gotten up to my formulation, the definition of a natural right. Remember, the Declaration employs the term natural rights, but it lists a couple: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Don't forget, there's a good discussion of the change from life, liberty, and property, which was the typical triad of fundamental natural rights. It comes from John Locke, really, who was lived a little bit later than Thomas Hobbes, because if you look back at the notes, the notion of rights, human rights, that have now, of course, completely refounded the human political world, in addition to providing the conceptual foundation for our constitution and regime. Thomas Hobbes lived in published Leviathan in 1651. John Locke, who was a bit younger than Hobbes, and read the Leviathan. In fact, the Leviathan was instantaneously sensational and spread throughout Europe. Locke lived a little bit later, and in 1689, during the period of what's called the Glorious Revolution in the English Constitution, in which James II, after the restoration of the monarchy, when the Puritans had overthrown Charles I, who was the son of James I, in 1641, and then beheaded him in 1649, establishing what was called the Protectorate, the radical, egalitarian, non-aristocratic, non-Church of England protectorate under Oliver Cromwell, some of which you know. But in 1656, the Civil War was over in England between the Protestants and the Anglicans, and the Puritans and the Anglicans, and between the Crown or the Royalists and the supporters of Parliament. And 1656 was the restoration of the monarchy with Charles II, Charles I's son. And then his son, James II, became king, but then tried to return to monarchical absolutism and Catholicism, by the way. And in 1688, the British people chased him out. And in 1688 and 9, that was called the Glorious Revolution, they invited William and Mary of Orange to come in and begin the House of Hanover, the refoundation of the British monarchy. And the British Parliament passed what was known as the Act of Succession to recognize the transfer of the title of the king away from James II to William of Hanover and his wife Mary. Hence, by the way, I've taught at William and Mary, so they call them Bill and Mary up at Williamsburg and William and Mary. But they also passed the Bill of Rights, and that's where the notion of a Bill of Rights comes from, and we'll talk about that when we talk about the Constitution and the ratification of the Constitution and the amendments to the Constitution. But John Locke then published his two treatises of government in 1689, and that text became remarkably influential upon the founders. It passed into the English academic world. It crossed the Atlantic, and by the generation of the 1620s, 30s, I'm sorry, I got my chronology around, 1720s, 30s, and 40s, and 50s, when the relatively young set of people who became the American founders were in college, Locke's teaching, and also, by the way, the French thinkers Baron de Montesquieu, the spirit of the laws, was also very influential, as we'll see when we read the Federalist Papers and talk about the construction of the Constitution. So the British political philosopher Locke and the French philosopher Montesquieu were very influential on a generation of the founders who came to political maturity during the Revolution. And of course, those set of ideas produced the Declaration, and that's what we're discussing, and also influenced the construction of the Constitution, and we'll talk more about that. So we had gotten up to the definition of a right, and as I mentioned, this is my definition, but I formulated it, and as I've said, and I hope I don't become repetitious, it's kind of hard to avoid that once you're good-looking and 69 years old, and yes, my birthday is September 12th, so the nation is planning a grand celebration on that remarkable day. But at any rate, let's begin again with our definition of this key term, because remember, as I just said, I am repetitive. The Declaration employs these terms, lists some rights, but it doesn't define what a right is. That's why we need political science professors. So this is my definition, and I've structured it quite deliberately. So what is a right, the definition of a right? The equal natural freedom to, if you're looking at the notes, to use our roughly equal natural powers, and I put roughly in there, you'll see for a reason, to obtain our equal natural needs and passions. Let me quote from the notes. I added these since Monday. Note the structure of this definition. It contains three nouns: freedom, power, and needs or passions. And even though freedom comes first, is mentioned first, in reality, the more fundamental term of these three nouns is needs and passions, which you'll see why when I unpack it, which give rise to our natural power to obtain those needs and passions, which generates the freedom to use those powers. There is a repeated set of two adjectives, natural and equal, actually equal and natural, and the reason for the repetition is to make you see that once you grasp the character of these needs and passions and powers and freedom, the three nouns in the definition, you will see that we all possess them by nature. They are in us naturally and equally. They are part of our nature, and we possess these qualities equally. And I even added, somewhat playfully, but in an attempt to help you understand this, if this were set as a mathematical proposition, as a self-evident truth like 2 + 2 = 4, this is how I would write it out in mathematical language. Natural rights equals en, deriving from the equivalent. So the point is to visualize the definition of rights as a self-evident truth. Indeed, all the 5 propositions of the second paragraph of the Declaration as a self-evident truth, which means that once a minimally rational human being sees and grasps the truth of each of the terms, like once you understand what 2 is, and once you understand what plus is, and once you understand what 2 is, as a self-evident truth, without having to have to go to college and get a degree in algebra or trigonometry or calculus, a 4-year-old kid knows and understands 2 + 2 = 4. And my point is to, and this is the aim of this whole discussion, is at the end of the discussion, I want you to see how and why the authors of the Declarations considered these and the following propositions to be self-evident truths, which is to say they are universally and objectively true. So let's unpack this definition, and then we'll turn to the rest of Monday's lecture. And you'll see the Declaration not only presents a kind of a picture of human beings as nature creates them, that's what we're about to talk about, but it also tells a little story about why, because you're going to see, if you just remember the language of the second paragraph of the Declaration, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The next statement says that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. So the Declaration is telling a little story about what the problem with our human nature is. It turns out, as you're going to see, that once you understand what a right is, you're going to understand why by nature they're insecure. And that leads to why we need government, which is the subject of today's lecture proper. So let's start with the definition. The more fundamental thing is needs and powers. You know, all natural beings, all beings created by nature, all animals, all fish, all plants. But let's confine ourselves here to animate nature, animals. All animals have constructed in them needs. Babies come out of the womb needing food and cell phones. Mice come out of their mother's wombs needing their mother's milk, and all mammals do. Snakes come out of their eggs needing food. Hence, most snakes lay their eggs next to supermarkets. I just made that up. So all natural beings, remember, this is not artificial. Nature makes beings this way, including us. So the moment that a natural being exists, by nature it has certain critical needs which are central to its survival. And understand, it is right by nature that they have these things. It's right by nature that animals get the food they need and that plants get the nutrition. Now, that's a kind of way of saying that nature is constructed so as to supply them, although nature isn't always successful in supplying them, but nevertheless they are constructed so as to need them. Those needs are in us by nature. And here's the point. As a human being, Your need for food, for instance, which is natural, is equal to any other human being's need for food. Now, what I mean is, it's not, by the way, it's not, I don't mean to say that some people like food more than others. I like food a lot, and you can obviously see the consequences of that. But what I mean is, there is no human being that needs food by nature to stay alive any more or any less than any other human being. And that's true of every lion, it's true of every mouse, it's true of every snake, it's true of every mongoose. I could spend the rest of our creative days listing every species on Earth. But every being created by nature has those needs and needs them equally. Now, again, that's not to say, first of all, it's not to say that living in society and culture that our needs can't be perverted. For instance, there's no natural need for chocolate or all the bizarre things that people come to love in society, or for like Cadillac convertibles. You don't need those things by nature. Many of our natural needs and passions are actually tempered or changed by living in culture. In the same way, by the way, by the analogy that I used on Monday, Chinese foot binding. Culture can shape and change and even pervert nature. And remember, the authors of the Declaration thought that nature stood as an objective standard of the goodness and badness of a culture. I think, for instance, that cultural relativity notwithstanding, the authors of the Declaration would have thought that it was not a good thing to truncate and handicap young women so that they couldn't walk anymore, and that wrapping their feet from infancy on actually robbed them of access to a natural potential that nature put in them. So, to go back to needs and passions, all animals that have needs, nature also puts in them passions for those. You come out of your mother's womb not only needing food, but willing to express your need for it. You have a passion for the things. Hunger is a natural passion. Nature puts hunger in us so that we feel impelled to act and obtain our needs. Every natural being, again, animal beings, so far as we know, plants don't have passions, although there's some interesting speculation on that. But we can come back to that. But all animals, for instance, clearly have a passion, a natural passion attached to the natural needs. So here's the first term of the definition, starting from the back of the definition. All natural beings have needs which nature also attaches passions. Those needs are constructed in their nature, hence they're natural, and they are equal. Now again, that doesn't mean that every natural being, that doesn't mean some animals get hungrier than others, but every animal has a natural need for food and a natural passion for it equally. My funny, vulgar, pious aunt used to put this truth, not that she necessarily studied the Declaration of Independence, but on this question of being equal in our natural needs. She would often put it, she would say, your blank doesn't smell any better or worse than anyone's blank. Now you can put that in, and it's, I'll give you a hint, it's the other end of the alimentary canal, but she had a point there. Even King George had to take a blank. And so in his natural needs, King George may claim a divine right to rule over you, or may claim to be a superior human being, but every human being needs food and needs it equally in order to stay alive. That's the first term. Let's move forward through the definition. The natural powers. Now note, I put roughly equal natural powers. I've already conceded, as the authors of the Declaration knew, that some animals are stronger, swifter, smarter, better looking than others, and yet, take any species: snakes, lions, policemen from New Jersey. I'm just kidding. I've gotten 3 tickets on I-95 in New Jersey, so I have a particular fondness for New Jersey and for its policemen. Anyway, not only does nature put a need and a passion in you, it gives each species a set of equipment, a set of powers or abilities to obtain those needs and passions. To snakes, it gives fangs, a sense of smell and swiftness. To mongooses and rats, it gives speed and mongooses, if you've ever seen Rikki Tikki Tavi by Rudyard Kipling, or The Jungle Book, it gives mongooses teeth and speed. So even though a snake might catch a mouse, in nature it's equally true that a mouse might get away. And also, mice again, I think my point you'll see is that to every species of animal, nature gives a certain set of abilities, powers, and equipment to obtain the needs. The powers are the ends to the means of obtaining the needs. Now, I say roughly equal because the truth of the matter is, and I think this is true for Locke and for Hobbes and probably the drafters of the Declaration, it's true, while there are differences in species, and wolves, they're all alpha males and all this kind of stuff, nevertheless, and oftentimes even natural groups form into competition for leadership and that kind of stuff. With all that aside, you'd have to say that roughly one lion is equal to another lion. And therefore, even in human beings, roughly, one's natural abilities to get food and sex and housing and all those kinds of things we need by nature are roughly equal. They're not absolutely equal, but roughly equal. Enough to say that, and by the way, let me give you Hobbes's cute take on this in chapter 13 of Leviathan. He says, yeah, some people are smarter or stronger than others, but yet those differences are not great enough to say that one human being has any more greater chance of life, because even Hercules has to take a nap in which Professor Pavorti, a weak and overweight old man, could come and drop a rock or put a bullet through, not a bullet, but a rock or a club through Hercules' head. So even though some may be weaker and stronger, Hobbes says, and I think he's true, he's right about this, taken all in all, every human being has roughly the same chances to stay alive. So we have roughly the same set of natural, equal and natural needs and passions. We have roughly, one human being is not really terribly naturally superior when it comes to staying alive. And here's the kicker, the last part, which is the first term in the definition, the equal natural freedom. If by nature no human being is superior to you in your natural abilities to obtain your equal natural needs, with the exception of the natural inequality of childhood or infancy and adulthood. We went over that on Monday. There are natural inequalities that do affect the amount of freedom you have. But those, remember, the Declaration turns to nature, and by nature, as I pointed out, you at the age of 20 have the natural ability to obtain your natural needs in a way that you did not at the age of 2 or 5 or 14. I don't know where you would put that. So my point is once you see that human beings are roughly equal in their natural needs and roughly equal in their natural powers, you see there is no natural superiority or inferiority, so much so that another human being has the better ability to tell you how to live your life and obtain the things you need by nature. So on one level, once you see that we are equal in our natural needs and passions and equal roughly in our natural needs and powers and abilities, then you see that we all possess the equal freedom to rule our own lives. And this is the sense in which the Declaration, in the second paragraph, when it says all men are created equal, parallels the statement about the powers of the earth in the first paragraph, to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal status to which the laws of nature and nature. So in that sense, even though, like nations, some are stronger, smaller, weaker, etc., yet every nation is equal in its sovereignty, in its independence, and that is what the Declaration means about human beings. Every human being has a natural right to rule him or herself as an adult. And that's why the principle of the Declaration is truly revolutionary vis-a-vis the British Constitution, from which we were separating ourselves. Because and by the way, all aristocratic and royal regimes, which, as I mentioned, are founded upon the idea of the natural right or divine right of kings, and all aristocratic class rule is based upon the natural superiority of an aristocratic class over the rest of the population. The Declaration washes all of that aside and says, no, every human being by nature is roughly equal to each other, and therefore no human being can claim a divine or a natural superior over, so much so that any other adult human being has the right to tell you how to live your life. So you all kind of experience these truths in your own life and maturation. And so that is what a natural right is. Every human being, by nature, is naturally free. Rousseau said this in The Social Contract. All men are born free. And that's and Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, Jefferson, and the American founders would have agreed. And that's why this second paragraph not only lays out a political theory of humanity, but it's also necessary to the revolution. Why are we entitled to rebel against King George and to separate ourselves? As you're going to see, that has to do with the last part of these propositions, the third set of great truths about government, which we'll turn to in a minute. So to go back to what I said, so that's what a right is. It's critical you grasp this because, my point, as I said, is once you see this and see the component elements of the concept of rights, you'll see why the drafters, Jefferson and the other drafters of the Declaration, considered these to be self-evident truths. Once you see what a human being is by nature, our natural needs and passions, our natural powers, and our natural freedom, you'll see that human equality and rights is a self-evident truth. That, at least, was their position. We can talk about this in class if you'd like to discuss this more. So let's continue then with the second, and as you'll see, this is the natural transition from the statement of human beings by nature as possessing rights equally free, equal in equality and freedom, to government. Because isn't it clear that government means inequality? Government means some people have more power than others. So you're going to see there's a little narrative, a little story in the Declaration about why our rights are insecure and why we need to invent government. So as you're going to see, government is among the things that are artificial by technology, that is to say by human art and making. But it turns out we have to invent government in order to make our natural rights secure. So for our next part of the discussion is to see why our rights are insecure, and then you'll see how that leads to government. And you'll also see how this leads to a yardstick for good and bad government, and not only where good government comes from and what the standards for legitimate government are, and you'll see that in the Diamond article for Friday, he explores this more on the notion of consent and legitimacy. But it also explains why the people have a natural right to get rid of the government if it ceases to be an effective instrument for the securing of their rights. So let's finish the story about our natural status. So nature gives us freedom and powers, etc. The problem is, if there is no natural ruler over us, then strictly speaking, we are all like little independent countries. And government and rule over others isn't natural. And therefore, strictly speaking, in our state of nature, to use a term from this set of principles and beliefs and these philosophers, in our state of nature, we have no natural rulers. We are all absolutely independent and free. Now, to get you into this concept, imagine if you've driven on the Autobahn in Germany, you know there are no speed limits, but let's say there were no highway laws. No laws at all restricting human behavior on the highway. If you got on I-26 to go to Columbia and there were no laws, let me ask you, this is a thought experiment. Would you ultimately be freer to travel on the interstate with no laws? Now, it's a little ironic because you say, well, wait a minute, if there were no laws, you could do whatever you want, you'd be absolutely free. Yes, but how large would your chances of actually getting to Columbia on I-26 be if nobody had any limits on their freedom? So it turns out, here's the great irony in this idea. Even though we're all natural free and there are no natural limits to our freedom because we're all naturally independent of anyone else, it turns out that human freedom with no limits on it becomes destructive of the very freedom and rights that we obtain. So as you're going to see, there's a kind of an irony or a tension in our natural freedom. If we don't put any limits on our natural freedom, we'll kill each other because we don't respect things like property or the integrity or the dignity of other human beings, and we just push them out of the way and everything becomes chaotic. So underneath this little narrative is the notion that unrestricted or unlimited freedom is actually self-destructive. It leads to human beings constantly destroying, because after all, if you put human beings with unlimited needs and powers and freedom with each other, they'll start fighting with each other. That was actually Hobbes's narrative in the Leviathan. So on one level, if you think about it, why are even though we have rights by nature they are also insecure. Where does the threat come from? Now, if you follow what I just said, there are three primary threats to nature, to our natural rights from our natural construction. One is other human beings. Other human beings become a threat to you if there are no limits to their freedom, and you become a threat to them if there are no limits to your freedom. So it turns out that the first kind of clear, obvious threat to our natural rights comes from other human beings. And therefore, as you're going to see, once we create government, that's what puts limits on people's freedom through laws and through enforcement, so that we so that we retain our essential freedom, but with limits on it, so that we don't kill each other all the time. But you think about it. Just after all, there was a pandemic that almost shut down the world. Hurricane Ida just came from the Gulf and up through. So it turns out that nature also, even though nature is generally beneficent and provides all kinds of things that we need, like coal and iPhones, and food and that kind of stuff, it actually turns out that human beings have to push nature a bit to make it more secure. We have to build houses against and shelters against the general insecurity of nature. And it turns out that sometimes nature as a whole is not always so friendly. If you believe in the Bible, you think that comes because of our fallen existence, because once we're kicked out of Egypt, we lose that constant 72-degree air-conditioned comfort with the well-stocked refrigerator in the Garden of Eden. And God tosses us out and to take our chances in the world. Well, sometimes that chance goes against us in the form of disease or and by the way, when you see these three natural threats to our natural rights from other human beings, from nature, and you're going to see the last one is ourselves, you'll see why there are very different opinions as to what the scope of government should be. A libertarian, well, I'm sure you've heard that term, thinks that government is only about protecting us from other people. That's why libertarians think the only legitimate thing a government to do is to have police, armies, and courts. But on the other hand, most Americans today believe that the government should secure our rights against things like natural disasters, like through FEMA and health insurance and that kind of stuff. So the reason there's so many different kinds of opinions as to what proper government should aim at is because there are different sources of insecurity to our natural rights. And last, if we think about it, you yourself can be destructive of your own rights. And as I say in the notes, suicides, suicidal depression. My beloved niece in 2015 committed suicide, and so I understand quite dramatically the effects of suicidal depression. And what about motorcyclists that don't wear helmets, or people that smoke cigarettes? Or can you take actions to destroy or undermine your own ability to live and to live independently? Sure, human beings can become their own worst enemies. So our natural rights are naturally insecure, either because of the presence of others and ourselves that have unlimited freedom, and therefore chaos results in the human condition, or because of the general insecurity in nature, or because even of the imperfect construction of ourselves. So, as you're going to see, that leads then to the last major set of teachings about government. What government is, where it comes from, what makes it legitimate, and why it is legitimate, and a self-evident truth that if the government fails to do what it's supposed to do, you may alter, change it, or abolish it. And as you're going to see, this idea is the link between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, for reasons you'll see. So why government? On the top of the second page of the notes for today. Since we have no natural rulers, we are equal in our needs, powers, and freedom. Our natural freedom is unlimited, and again, as I just mentioned, it leads in chaos, and actually, when freedom is absolute, it becomes destructive of freedom. So, as you're going to see, this leads to one of the great ironies and tension-ridden principles in the Declaration, that in order to keep yourselves free in society, you have to put limits on your freedom. We'll come back to that in a minute. So, what's the consequence? Human beings, at the top of the notes, human beings must create, invent an artificial, as I've already said, supplement to our natural condition. Just as we create artificial structures called houses, with, to be sure, alarm systems. And why do we put alarm systems? Not to keep us away from bears or pandemics, but to keep us away from potential thieves. To secure our natural needs for comfort and safety, and protect us from other predatory human beings and the cruelty of unpredictable conditions in our natural environment. A house is an artificial thing, but it's an artificial instrument intended to satisfy or secure our natural needs. So as in the exact same way, government is an artificial overlay or instrument that human beings create for a specific end or purpose, which is to render our rights secure. So this artificial and supplementary invention is called government. To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. That's the phrase from the second paragraph. What is government made of? What's the stuff of government? Well, here's what it is. We all take, and this comes from Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, and the other theorists, but also this is the story of the transition from generally what is called the state of nature into the state of civil society. We take some of our natural freedom and power over ourselves and pool it. We contract. We give up some of our freedom, and then we create a common pool of freedom and power. Because remember, our freedom comes from our own power over ourselves. So we agree to put boundaries to our power. And all that leftover power that was absolute, we kind of add it to the common pool of power that every human being limits and contributes. Again, we draw limits and boundaries to our personal power and freedom, and then we pool it together, and then we give it to some designated human being so they have enough power to restrain the rest of us and protect us. We give up some of our natural rights in order to protect our natural rights. Easier to say, much harder to live out, as you'll see. So that's what government is. Government is the pooled power that comes from all of us putting boundaries on our natural power and freedom. It's like if we were like in a poker game when you ante up and put something in the kitty. The common kitty is come from the chips that you put in. So we all agree that our unlimited freedom and power is destructive to ourselves and others. We decide to kind of put limits to that, and out of that limited pool, that's where the common pool of power called government. That's where governmental power comes from. Now, how government? If we're equal by nature, how can we create the artificial inequality that defines government? Now, think about this. I can get you to do something I want you to do. Let's say, give me a $10 bill. I can do it one of two ways. I can hold a gun to your head and say, give me that $10 bill or I'll blast your brains out. That is through terror or compulsion. And generally, most of us would say that when you terrorize or compel a human being through terror or fear to do something, think about this. You can beat a dog and make a dog obey you because you can terrorize it. If you think about it, when you treat a human being like a dog, you are dehumanizing. You're taking away that human person's human nature from them. Because what defines our human nature, as we've already seen, according to these philosophers and to the drafters of the article, is what makes us different. And by the way, you could say this is biblical too. We're made in the image of God. It means we have the power of reason. So if you terrorize a human being into obeying you, you have deprived them of their ability to reason. The other way, of course, that you can get somebody to do something you want them to do is by persuading them. And if I persuade you to give me a $10 bill because of perhaps you want to reward me for my good looks, I don't want to make you ill. Thank goodness we're facing each other in a computer screen. But seriously, if I persuade you to do something, I'm actually asking you to use your power of reason. If I persuade you to give me a $10 bill or to accept me as your governor, then I am actually honoring your human nature, respecting it, because I'm asking you to use your natural human powers. And if you agree to do something through your own reason, you retain your human freedom. And as you're going to see, this difference between terror or intimidation versus persuasion is the difference between illegitimate and legitimate government. If you agree to freely to do something, you do not cease to be a free being. You retain your humanness, even if at the same time you accept limits to your freedom and rule of others over you, if you agree to it. So that's what government is. That's where it comes from. And as you're going to see, its purpose then is to add a supplement to our natural condition, which renders our natural rights secure and enjoyable in a way that they would not be if we did not invent this common instrument of government over us. So it turns out that this idea of government and the core ideas of the Declaration have certain natural problems or questions. I like to say, sometimes I like to say these are the two problematics. Now, problematic sounds like a fancy word. And when something is problematic, it means this, that either inherent in the nature of that situation is an unsolvable tension, which you can address and you can kind of tame, but you can't eliminate fully. Problematic often means something also that when you try to solve one set of problems, that unleashes others. Either way, it turns out that these fundamental beliefs of the Declaration, these fundamental self-evident truths, let's call them that there, it turns out there are two sets of tensions that come from them. Let's explore them. And they have to do with the nature of government. So one of them, and this is the bottom of the second page of the notes for today. One, we have to give up freedom to secure our freedom. Let that sentence sink in. We have to give up some freedom to retain our freedom. And by my analogy to the highway, by accepting speeding laws and no passing laws and no tailgating laws and that kind of stuff, it turns out you actually keep your freedom to drive on the interstate or on the highway in a way that you wouldn't have. Again, I think I've gone over that enough. But then, again, let this idea, you have to give up freedom to keep your freedom. Well, the natural question is, well, how much freedom and rights must be given up? And I have to say, there's no easy answer. That's what government is about. It's about trying to find that right line between how much freedom you keep and how much freedom you have to give up in order to secure your and everyone else's rights. We're right in the middle of that debate right now with the pandemic. Do Americans have the right not to be vaccinated? Do they have the right to say no to mask mandates and lockdowns and everything? These public measures are controversial, but exactly, they point to exactly the same tension in this. Remember, the whole point of government is to give up freedom to keep us free. Now, again, where's the proper dividing line? Take Hurricane Ida or Hurricane Katrina or any other natural disaster. Under those circumstances, think about it. Once a disaster happens, the first thing that the government declares is martial law. Now, martial means warlike. It has to do with Mars, the god of war, and it means military rule. And so after a natural disaster, for instance, when martial law is declared, there's a complete lack of civil freedom. The government could declare a curfew to keep you in your houses. It can allow people to use radical measures to defend their property, like guns, etc. My point is that under martial law, where we're almost like living in an army, civil freedom almost evaporates. But almost everyone would say, well, at least for a while after civil order and society is restored, we need that radical deprivation of freedom. But most of us would not want to live that way all the time. That's, I think, why certain public measures, like in the pandemic, have become so controversial. So on the one hand, you can imagine some situations in which you'd have to give up more of your freedom, and yet, so where's that proper balance? Again, that's what politics is about. That's what government is about. And by the way, it's not easy to find that right balance, that right midpoint between too much freedom and too little freedom. That tension, that question, that problem is inherent in the tension in our founding principles. The second problematic set of problems is as we've seen, the very nature of government is that you give some more power to some than others. It's the very inequality of power between the government and the governed that actually enables the governed to live securely. I think I've explained that fully enough. But then here's the question. Okay, government means having some people having more power. Cop, when you're stopped for speeding, has more power over your life than you have over yours at that point, or certainly you have over his or hers. So the second great problem or question that comes out of the principles of the Declaration is how much power should government have? And you can also arrange this as a series of extremes with a midpoint. So on this question of how much power government should have, one extreme is no or too weak government. Either no government, and then we're back to our natural condition where we're killing each other all the time, or stealing each other's iPhones, or Hershey's Kisses, or whatever. But you can imagine then, okay, you create a government, But then it turns out if government doesn't have enough power, the natural rebelliousness of human beings, and you have to admit that this is one problem. We all have our natural passions, and with no containment of those passions, people enjoy sometimes getting the better of others or doing terrible things to other human beings. So on the one extreme, you could have no government, or government too weak that it has no power to restrain the governed, and therefore it sinks back into anarchy. As we're going to see, that was something of a problem with the Articles of Confederation, our first failed constitution. On the other extreme, you could have government having too much power, and there was a word for that at the founding, that Locke and Hobbes and Rousseau and Montesquieu and the authors, Jefferson and the authors of the Declaration agreed. When government had too much power, and then actually it became a threat to rights, and the word for that kind of position of too much power or misused power is tyranny. And of course, that's the third section of the Declaration of Independence, to prove that the king had in fact exercised too much power over us illegitimately and had become a tyrant. So, by the way, let me just say that great literature such as Greek tragedy and comedy, many political analysts over the centuries have tried to give form and psychological meaning to this. So let me try to put this in a kind of a literary fashion. This is the Bible, this is Aristotle, and great political philosophers. Human beings themselves are a kind of an interesting, take the Bible, for instance. It says we're created in God's image. That means there's a principle of divinity in us. So, but in some ways we're just animals, or we're like other animals. We have those needs and passions that I spoke about. And all of us needs our own natural kitty litter, because we all have those functions. So, but my point here is there's a phrase from theology that says man. Actually, it's from one of the Psalms. Man is just a little lower than the angels, but we're not angels. And by the way, you're going to see James Madison in the Federalist Papers points that out. If men were angels, but we're not. Maybe my mother, may she rest in peace, was. But we're not angels. We are animals, but we're also divine animals. We're tension-ridden midpoints between a god and an animal, a god and a beast, or an angel and a beast. And therefore, most of us live. And by the way, because I've also studied much literature, and I love to teach politics through literature, like through Shakespeare. And again, most of great literature explores this kind of psychological or spiritual notion of tyranny. So when some human being gets so much power over another that it destroys the natural inequality between human beings, then you'd almost say that person comes to think of themselves as a god. Think of Voldemort. Think of Stalin. Think of Hitler. Think of Mao. Think of my department chair, Dr. Dunn. I'm just kidding about that one. But you could say the psychological or spiritual dimension of power, of tyranny, is it's when a human being has so much power that they begin to behave like gods to other human beings and consider other human beings as animals beneath them. And of course, that's why much of what literature does through tragedies explore this, because generally speaking, once a human being thinks that he or she is a god, they destroy themselves and everyone around them. And that's why tragedy is often the most appropriate vehicle for exploring tragedy. So the framers thought that government could become distorted by having too much power, in which case government no longer ceases to be a means of securing rights, but rather government itself becomes destructive of natural rights. If you think about it, we have this phrase, the cure is worse than the disease. So here's the second great problem or issue of the Declaration, which I'm trying to formulate. When it comes to government can have too little power, in which case it's almost like anarchy and can't protect our rights. On the other hand, government can have too much power and become destructive of our rights. What clearly is the solution? It's clearly the middle point, to find a mean or a balanced point. There has to be, in other words, good government is government that has enough power to govern, but not enough power to tyrannize. And that's the last sentence in my notes, and that, I think, is a good formulation for the declarations, for a summary of the Declaration's teaching v. government. So what are the 5 propositions in the second paragraph that are self-evident truth, and I hope my discussion has helped you to see why the framers thought they were self-evident truth. That we are equal, that we have rights, that government exists to secure rights, that whenever government, and that legitimate government comes from the agreement or consent of the governed, because that's how you preserve the humanity of the governed, and that whenever government becomes destructive of its purpose of securing rights, we have the right to alter and abolish it. Those 5 principles in the second paragraph can be groupable into the 3 great sets of theoretical teachings that I've described. What nature is, what human nature is, and what government is. And so I hope what this discussion of the core principles of the Declaration has done is, 1, make them intelligible to you, and 2, to ground them in a discussion of the text. Yes, I've given you a little bit of philosophic and historical background to understand them, but generally speaking, all of these ideas and concepts are in the text of the Declaration. They have to be unpacked a bit, but that's why you came to college. And then, of course, my larger aim is to help you see why they thought these were self-evident truths. Once you grasp what a human being is by nature, as nature constructs us, you will see that we are equal, that we have rights, that we need government, and that good government comes into being to protect those rights, and when it doesn't, and it comes from us agreeing to it and not being terrorized into it, and that last, when it becomes destructive of those rights, we have the right to alter and abolish it. As you're going to see, the Declaration actually is naturally leads to consideration of the next step in the American founding, which is the creation of our governing institutions. If you go back to my definition of what a regime or a constitution is in the first day of class, we've now examined the fundamental set of ideas that American political life is founded upon. And now our next step is to see how the governing institutions meet the needs of the founding principles. And we're going to see that what I'm setting up is the next couple of weeks for you. We'll see that we had a first experiment in a regime or constitution called the Articles of Confederation, which didn't work. It failed to secure our rights as individuals and as a nation, and therefore we sought to alter or abolish it, which leads to the Constitutional Convention and the Constitution and the ratification of the Constitution, which, as you will see, will complete the story of the founding.